My name is Rachel Williams, and I'm a student board member of the Buckley program. Our third and final panel of the day will be on liberal education in the ideal university, which will be moderated by Norma Thompson. This next segment will provide an interesting look into liberal education from a variety of perspectives, including those of distinguished scholars of history, politics, education, and the humanities. And now to introduce our moderator. Norma Thompson is the Associate Director of the Whitney Humanities Center and Senior Lecturer in the Humanities here at Yale, as well as the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Humanity major in Yale College. She is also a graduate of Bowdoin College and University of Chicago. Thompson has been published extensively in academic journals and has written multiple books on topics ranging from political philosophy to literature. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Thompson.
Thank you, Rachel. So before I introduce the panel, I want to say a word about the theme. In recent years, I've been privileged to be a part of a group from Yale, Columbia, and the University of Chicago, funded by the Teagle Foundation, that meets once a semester to discuss, compare, and analyze our respective core programs. We have had the question before us constantly of what is a liberal education and what are its ideal conditions. You might be surprised to learn that Yale College came out as the clear winner in this august company on the ideal conditions of our core program, that is, the Freshman Directed Studies. There are three key features of the first-year Directed Studies program that can be considered ideal. It's okay if I take this assertive stance. Number one, it is elitist. Selection of students is by application, which is fiercely competitive, or by personal whim of the Yale College Dean of Admissions, whose agenda is to prevent certain prospective students from attending Harvard, Princeton, or Stanford. The end result is that every single person in the DS room wants to be there. The total number of students is 175. Seminars are capped at 15. Number two, DS students read, discuss, and write about the same great books at the same time. The end result is the creation of an amazing intellectual community, never to be replicated in their college curricula, never to be replicated in life, but never forgotten either. Finally, three, DS allows a cumulative benefit without being a major. 6 courses out of 9 freshman year is a lot. By spring semester, it allows the students to analyze, for example, the modern use of the ancients in an educated and informed way. When Hobbes misreads Aristotle, the students know it, and they can cite book and chapter. But DS doesn't require its students to devote their lives to the program in some St. John College kind of way. Our freshmen go on to be pre-med, pre-law, pre-business, pre-East Asian majors, pre-humanities, pre-anything. They're done with the program in May. In sum, I've been teaching in directed studies for 26 years, and consequently, I know how to fix liberal education. Not that anyone is asking me. And anyway, I haven't said anything that Russell Kirk didn't say first. So let us proceed. All of our panelists are impressive scholars, prolific writers, and also well-known advocates for liberal education. Here's a tease. Let me just say, I recommend their CVs as inspirational reading. Here, I will restrict myself to saying 2 sentences about each in their order of appearance. First, Michael Aeschliman, my immediate left, is professor of Anglophone culture at the University of Italian Switzerland, Lugano, and professor emeritus of education at Boston University. He is the author of The Restitution of Man, C.S. Lewis and the Case Against Scientism. He edited a critical edition of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, and most strikingly, he has published 175 essays, reviews, articles in general interest and scholarly magazines, including National Review, First Things, The Weekly Standard, Partisan Review, etc. So a lot of you already know this man. Second will be Keith Whittington, all the way down, who is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University, who writes lots of authoritative books about American constitutional law, politics and history, and American political thought. He's one of the authors of the multi-volume American Constitutionalism, and one of his most recent single-authored books is Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Is there some reason, by the way, that we are at the Omni and not at Silliman College? Halloween was days ago. I'm confused about the setting here. Finally, Michael Roth in the middle has been president of Wesleyan University for the past 11 years, was formerly president of California College of the Arts, and was the founding director of the Scripps College Humanities Institute in Claremont, California. Somehow, President Roth has found time to author 6 fascinating historiography-type books, and an additional one titled Beyond the University: Why Liberal Education Matters, that is on 24-hour reserve at Bass Library up the street. That means that it's in demand. Someone is reading it. Go figure. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson, for that introduction, and I'd like to thank my hosts. I've asked one of the assistants in the program, Mr. Swain, to pass out something to you. When you get to be my age, and especially when you've flown halfway around the world, you like to think that maybe if you give a piece of paper out with something on it, the written word remains, because I'm haunted and tormented by the idea that words on air just disappear. I've been teaching for a long time, and I wake up at night thinking about that once in a while. So for bringing me here from several thousand miles away, I want to thank my generous hosts at Yale. And it's a university with which I have no personal or historical links. The remarks I'm about to give are going around now, and so you'll have them in front of you if you don't already. I have no personal links to Yale, being a grateful alumnus of Columbia. However, the approach that I am taking this evening, the approach that follows, is not mainly dictated by gratitude. I call this Liberal Education in the Ideal University a Yale honor roll. I start with a passage from a philosopher once very well known in this country in academic circles who taught at Chicago, with which Professor Thompson has strong links, and also at Cornell for many years. His name was E.A. Burt, and he graduated from Yale College in 1915. And he made a statement in an early book from the 1920s that's been much quoted over the years and deserves to be quoted. He said, and this is on the sheet that's going around, "There is no escape from metaphysics. The only way to avoid metaphysics is to say nothing." I take it that what Burt was saying was that thinking itself, cognition, rationality, language, these are metaphysical phenomena. This is part of the great blessing of being a human being, that we have access to other minds, to other worlds of discourse, to modes of action, to other human beings somewhat different from us. And this statement, it seems to me, is a wonderful thing to have in one's repertory. We moved to a second figure on my Yale honor roll, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was a great figure at Yale, the youngest dean in the history of Yale Law School at age 29, and then the youngest university professor, up to that point at least, the youngest university president by becoming president of the University of Chicago in 1929. He led that university from 1929 to 1951, and did a lot of thinking about education and wrote a powerful book about education called The Higher Learning in America. It's a defense of liberal education. I suspect my colleagues here on the panel are familiar with both him and the book in some degree. And Chicago became famous for its required undergraduate curriculum in the first 2 years. He might be said to have taken Burt's point, written in the 1924 book, The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science. He might be said to have taken it seriously, and that he tried to restore or recover or renew the idea that every decent educational project, reflective educational project, has an inextricable and irreducible metaphysical dimension. I think he was a great man. And on the bibliography that's going around, there's some background reading on him if you're interested in pursuing some more knowledge of him. Clark Kerr, who was chancellor of the University of California system in the 50s and 60s, and a very different kind of university president, he said, and I quote, that Hutchins was the last of the giants, in the sense that he was the last of the university presidents who really tried to change his institution in higher education in any fundamental way, end quote. Now that's 1963. I'm going to suggest with another member of this honor roll that someone more recently has aspired to, who really did try to do this also, was my colleague at Boston University, John Silber, another Yale alumnus. Then a comment that has less force because of Professor Thompson's helpful introductory remarks of me, because I haven't been following the Yale curriculum. But the third figure I mentioned, who's another Yale figure, although not an alumnus of Yale, if you have your sheet, it's number 3 on the sheet. This is a comment of a longtime Yale philosophy professor, John E. Smith, actually a Columbia person, graduate of the college and PhD, but he was Clark Professor of Philosophy at Yale from 1952 to 1991, died in 2009. Quite a distinguished philosopher, also an editor of real distinction, editor of the works of Jonathan Edwards, a great Yale figure. And he wrote a letter to the Columbia Alumni Magazine back in '87, and perhaps thinking like what he articulated here led to the changes in the curriculum of Yale College, about which Professor Thompson just spoke so vigorously. He said in this letter published in the Columbia Magazine in June 8, 1987, he said, "I have never had the advantage of teaching juniors and seniors, all of whom come to upper-class courses with a homogeneous educational background represented by the Columbia Core curriculum," which he had taken and which is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary, in which the first 2 years all students take a couple of required courses in the first 2 years. The problem that's indicated here is the problem that Professor Thompson mentioned. It's the problem of not having common factors in education. And I take it that if liberal education is going to have real effect, it has to mean that students have some specific common factors. When we reach the work of E.D. Hirsch, another great Yale figure, we're going to see Hirsch looking at elementary schools in this light, that students need common factors. They need a common bond of education. Rusty Reno was talking in the previous session about the we. E pluribus unum, from many come one. It seems increasingly in the United States during my lifetime that we've had e pluribus pluribus, from many comes many. And so here the issue that's being raised, which I gather from what Professor Thompson was just saying has to some extent really been remedied, is the issue of radical pluralism. It's the issue of not having common factors. People are studying and majoring early. They have, what do they have to talk about? They have to talk about a vile pop culture, which now populates the airwaves. They have a commercial culture that besets them and preys on them in ways that increase their vanity and diminish their intelligence all the time. And what do they have in common? They have hormones running amok for 4 or 5 years, but they don't have common texts that would give them something to talk about outside of class. That would be a common bond. And that, I think, is part of the story of the U.S. in the last 60 or 70 years, to which Rusty Reno was drawing attention in the earlier session about the we. One comment in passing about this, there is obvious reasons why this has happened, and I've given some bibliography on that for some of you who may not know about them on the second sheet that I gave out. It's certainly true that in reaction to fascism and Nazism in the 30s and 40s, and to some extent reaction to communism, American educators decided that any kind of memorization, any kind of requirement of common knowledge was dangerous because it led to authoritarianism, it encouraged authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. And so we have a massively shall we say, unfocused educational project going on in this country, especially at the elementary level, in which the poorest children in the country are not the beneficiaries of the kind of education that I got as the son of an immigrant starting out in a school north of Boston in 1954, where I started first grade. I got a wonderful education in the public schools of New England in those days, and nowadays with very little in common, with no phonics, with very little actual development of literacy, our young people are not getting access to not only a high culture, not getting access to the normal processes of literacy that would enable them to be occupationally successful, be able to be decent citizens and self-respecting members of communities. So this issue of radical pluralism, which I talk about with Smith's comment, Professor Smith, longtime professor of philosophy here at Yale, it seems to have been remedied. In fact, the very existence of the committee that Professor Thompson mentioned is extraordinarily interesting, because Chicago and Columbia are traditionally the two of the major research universities with undergraduate colleges that have been most interested in undergraduate liberal education and requiring courses of students in the first 2 years. Chicago after Columbia, but even more in some ways than Columbia. The fourth figure that I want to mention is another Yale figure, Harry V. Jaffa, and one of my colleagues was out there at Scripps, one of those 5 colleges in California. I guess is it Pomona, not too far from Los Angeles, where Harry V. Jaffa was a professor for many years. He was a New York Jew who got into Yale College at a time when Yale College was not welcoming to Jews, Harry V. Jaffa. He became a great friend of William F. Buckley and a major figure in National Review, and as some of you may know who are conservatives, a great figure, in fact, in political philosophy in the United States, drawing attention not just to Lincoln as a sentimental figure, but to Lincoln as a natural law, natural rights thinker, and as a sage. Arguably our most philosophically profound president, even though he never got an education at an elite institution on either of the two coasts. And Harry V. Jaffa did more than anyone, I think, to show us that Lincoln was a profound thinker, a democratic thinker, but not a sentimentalist, and a democratic thinker at a very high level. So I highly recommend his 2 books. His 2 great books on Lincoln that have been called the greatest books ever written on Lincoln, and there have been a lot of books written on Lincoln. Crisis of the House Divided, which is a study of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, 1959, and then at the very end of his life, toward the very end of his life, in 2001, his second book on Lincoln, which is called A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of Civil War. And I give you a few articles on Jaffa. Jaffa is a good example then of a number of things, of someone from a previously discriminated against group, a Jew from New York. These people were not welcome at Ivy colleges, particularly at Princeton and Yale for a long, long time, who came to Yale College and did extremely well, and became one of the great figures in American political philosophy in the 20th and, in fact, the 21st century. And in fact has a real school of people associated out there in Claremont with the Claremont Review and so forth. So we go on to John Silber, another Yale figure. John was also from Texas. He was a one-armed man, as some of you may or may not know. He was a very small man. He came to Yale, did a PhD in philosophy, and he became a great figure in American university education, but also in public education in Massachusetts, and as chairman of the State Board of Education, and also the author of Chelsea Partnership with a very poor, the poorest city and state of Massachusetts, whose schools Boston University took over. And the last person, and I'm going to have to leave this to you to read a little bit about, is the great figure of E.D. Hirsch, also Yale PhD, who I think has engaged in the most impressive effort at any level of American education in my lifetime in his core knowledge curriculum. K-6 curriculum is now used in about 1,500 schools, and schools abroad, and the national curricula of Portugal and Britain are both based on the core knowledge curriculum. So this is my Yale honor roll, and I've given you some more background here on the sheet because I didn't think I would have enough time to do justice to these very great men. They do happen to be men at a time when this institution wasn't open to women, and thank heavens it now is. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in what's an excellent program, and I appreciate the opportunity to be back in New Haven. I received my PhD in political science at Yale, and it was quite a culture shock when I arrived there, but I learned a few things, and so I'm particularly appreciative of the years I spent there, and I appreciate the opportunity to come back, although I have to admit that when I was actually here, I was very eager to escape New Haven as soon as possible. So I don't mind short visits. So I appreciate being here today. My parents were met in college. They went to a small public state institution as first-generation college students in Texas. And they went to college for very practical reasons. They wanted a better life than their parents and their grandparents had. They wanted the opportunity to have better jobs where you could work inside in the air conditioning, out not in the heat of the Texas sun, jobs where they could make a better living for themselves and ultimately a better living for their children and hopefully their grandchildren as well. So they had very specific and kind of practical reasons for going to college. And I think lots of students come to colleges and take advantage of colleges for those kinds of very specific practical reasons. They majored in practical things that led directly to jobs. Made my father very nervous when I didn't follow his lead and go into the sciences when I went to university at the University of Texas. I tried to convince him that I was not completely wasting my time and money at the University of Texas by getting a degree in finance, among other things. But part of what intrigued me about being at college was that college seemed to be a place where people were taking ideas seriously. And I was somebody who took ideas seriously. I learned fairly early on growing up in Texas that my comparative advantage was not going to be playing football. And so eventually I stopped. And my comparative advantage was going to be a focus on books. And so I was a diligent student. I liked to read. I liked to think. I liked to talk to people about ideas. And I found college to be an extraordinary place, precisely because it was places where you could talk about ideas. You could think seriously about ideas. You could read interesting books, and other people would want to read them too and want to talk them through. Sometimes that even happened in classes. Not always. You had to pick the right classes. You had to find the right faculty who would actually help guide you through those books, who would have those kinds of conversations. And fortunately, I was able to find at least some faculty at the University of Texas that encourage those kind of discussions. But I also found people outside the classroom context as well. And one thing I discovered about universities was there are places where there are also often multiple tracks in which people were pursuing ideas and pursuing their educations. There were things you were learning in the classroom, things you were learning from the curriculum, things you were learning from the professors as you're growing up. You're also often learning things on the side. So my parents took ideas very seriously. My mother emphasized from an early age that I should have a love for Thomas Jefferson and all of his ideas. My father, when he thought I was old enough, introduced me to National Review and Ayn Rand. And ultimately, I continued to explore those ideas, and mostly I explored those ideas outside of university classrooms. I had a second education in the conservative intellectual movement and the libertarian intellectual movement that was not being done in classes, was not being led by professors, but being led by other students, and in conversations with other students, and in conversations with organizations that help nurture those kinds of ideas on college campuses. But the fact that you could have those kind of conversations on college campuses, and they were useful homes for engaging in those ideas, I thought was extraordinarily valuable, and as a consequence, I wanted to make my career ultimately on university campuses. Well, recently I have to say I've become quite nervous about the state of universities, and one reason why I've now find myself trying to talk about universities and what values they serve in American life, and talk about the way universities are organized and what we do on university campuses, in particular in the context of free speech, is because I realized there's a lot of things that I thought I was taking for granted about American universities and how they operated. I took for granted that people were there to take ideas seriously. I took for granted that people understood that universities were places where controversial ideas were going to be discussed, and people were going to come to controversial conclusions that were sometimes outside the mainstream of American society more generally. But you could also encounter people who disagreed with you on American college campuses. And you can have good faith arguments with people you disagreed with about ideas that were ultimately important for trying to guide our society into the future. And you could wrestle with those ideas and try to make decisions about how you ought to organize your own thinking and how you ought to contribute to trying to make America a better place and ultimately the world a better place as well. And that seems under threat now on college campuses. It seems under threat in part because of what happens on college campuses themselves. The colleges have become places where increasingly people are intolerant of talking about controversial ideas, that they want to enforce orthodoxies, that they're concerned that there's not going to be a wide-ranging set of debates on college campuses. And as a consequence, we see reflections of that increasing intolerance in things like shouting down speakers on college campuses, disinviting speakers on college campuses. But we also see it in the increasing homogeneity of college faculty as well, where there's increasingly fewer and fewer conservatives on college campuses at the faculty ranks, and as a consequence, fewer conservative ideas can be talked about seriously in a classroom context. Fewer conservatives on campus can help guide students in thinking about conservative ideas on college campuses. But we also see threats to college campuses and their ability to think about hard ideas from outside college campuses as well. And some of those threats from outside come from the political right, where people are skeptical about the nature of college campuses. They regard them as hostile territory, and there's some good reasons why they ought to regard them as hostile territories. But the result of regarding them that way and attacking them that way is ultimately to try to tear down the capacity of American universities to be places where you can talk about controversial and difficult ideas. If we take universities seriously as places where people ought to be thinking about ideas and thinking about ideas that are often difficult and hard, we also ought to recognize universities are going to be places where people are sometimes going to voice opinions that conservatives find discomforting. They're going to find faculty who are going to have opinions that conservatives find discomforting. They're going to see students who have opinions that conservatives find discomforting. And we shouldn't be trying to drive that out of universities. Instead, what we ought to be focused on is how do we harness that energy, harness those ideas, and engage with those ideas on a university campus? How can we have those students and those faculty who are attracted and interested and engaged by left-wing ideas also trying to think about conservative ideas and take them equally seriously and engage them in a serious fashion as well? So I think we have threats both inside universities that are trying to close down universities and what they do, but we also have threats from outside universities that are also ultimately uninterested in universities as places where ideas can be discussed, where controversies can take place, but instead are concerned with imposing their own kind of orthodoxy, not the same kind of orthodoxy those on campus would try to pursue, but an orthodoxy those outside campus would try to pursue. I think there's also forces outside universities, which find some homes inside universities as well, that ultimately want to iron out the parts of universities that are concerned with ideas, what we might think of as the liberal arts traditionally understood. So as I said, one of my degrees from my undergraduate degrees is in finance. My father was in the sciences. He wanted me to go into the sciences. These are important parts of what universities do. Part of what they do is prepare students for concrete, practical lives. And those parts of universities that are engaging seriously in business schools and sciences and engineering, they're doing important work in that regard. They're expanding our knowledge of how the world works. They're training students for important work to come down the road. But that's not the only thing universities ought to do. And it's sometimes easy, I think, for those on the outside of universities to think that that's actually the only valuable stuff that universities do, and we ought to drive out and minimize what's happening in the social sciences and humanities, for example, where the value seems less clear, the ultimate economic payoff is not as obvious. But ultimately, those two are important components of universities, and they ought to work hand in hand. We want to make space on university campuses, both for liberal arts, for the social sciences and humanities, where people are thinking about ideas, they're abstracted away from the material, concrete realities of the day-to-day world, but also places in universities where we can think about concrete vocations and concrete professions and details of how life is organized and how we make a living. That includes business schools, journalism schools, sciences, and engineering. Those two are also important components of university campuses. We want to try and make them work together. And I think sometimes there's an instinct and a desire to try to crowd out one, to minimize one, to see one as a threat, and the other one is something that we ought to hold up and emphasize to a greater degree. But universities are going to continue to be, I think, valuable institutions within American society, places where people can think about difficult ideas, try to come to conclusions about how we ought to organize ourselves in the future, try to expand the scope of human knowledge and communicate what we've learned about humanity, about the world, how it operates to our students, to our fellow scholars, to the general public as well. Then we need to make space on university campuses where we can take ideas seriously, where students can explore controversial and difficult ideas, where faculty can explore controversial and difficult ideas, and that will often be within the context of liberal arts. But if we're going to do that seriously and if we're going to do that in a meaningful way, we need intellectual diversity on campus, we need people with different points of view to be operating on college campuses, and we need college campuses to be places where we can take a range of views seriously, and we can engage with them seriously, not try to shut them down, close them off, hide away from them, but instead that we see people out who think differently than we do, who want to also think seriously about what the future holds. And we want to engage with those people and try to talk through our differences in order to make progress together. And that, I think, ultimately is the promise of American universities. It's what pulled me into American universities, wanted for me to make a life at American universities. And I hope that they can continue to do that into the future. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Michael Roth. I'm from the university up the road, Wesleyan University, and I haven't been among so many conservatives in a while. I actually can't remember. And I was wondering, so what the heck am I doing here? You know, you probably have this, I don't know, you maybe have had this nightmare yourselves of finding yourself, teacher's nightmare is finding yourself in a class where you don't know what the heck you're supposed to teach, or finding yourself at a party and you don't know why you're there. And I was just listening to the previous panel and listening to my distinguished co-panelists here today, and I'm thinking, how did I get invited here? And if my friends at Wesleyan find out I'm here, I'm sunk. So I thought maybe because Wesleyan is the ideal university where liberal education does not depend on requirements and the university is not known for producing sheep, no matter how excellent. But I figured that couldn't be quite it, that it wasn't the affection for the liberal arts university in Middletown that was driving this invitation. And then I thought, well, it must be because my book is on reserve at the library here, because that book is published by Yale University Press. So it's probably the press who gave the program a call and said, the sales are dipping. I have a new book coming out next year with Yale on free speech, political correctness, and such things. But meanwhile, bring him to the conference and we can sell some books. I have, perhaps you know, called for an affirmative action program for people like you. I have called for an affirmative action program at universities for conservative thinkers in the Wall Street Journal. And that endeared me to conservatives who love affirmative action, and it endeared me to my comrades on the left because although we almost never talk about affirmative action anymore, we talk about, unless we're being sued, we talk about equity and inclusion. But suddenly, my friends on the left, they were upset that I had, as they said, sullied the words affirmative action by tying them to conservatives. But I was delighted because I've written a lot of op-eds and not so many of them got the attention and the venomous response as the call for an affirmative action program for conservatives. That is a program at Wesleyan that we have to promote intellectual diversity, and I'm glad to say that we don't have to meet at the hotel in town. We actually have lectures on campus. So in the next five and a half minutes, I give you a summary of my view of liberal education, which is very different from my co-panelists, I think. I take the American pragmatist view of liberal education. I think the liberal arts model that America inherited from Europe is antithetical to the pragmatist tradition that tied liberal education in the United States to inquiry, not just to the ability to say you have read some books that other people have told you were important, but actually to be empowered to engage in inquiry to create new knowledge. Jefferson is at the foundation of the American view of liberal education, but Emerson is in there, Jane Addams is in there, and John Dewey is probably the patron saint of this view of liberal education, not as checking off books that you have read, but as being, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, empowered to act in the world because of the breadth of your education and the depth of your conceptual understanding, which allows you to learn new things, to face new challenges, and to make new knowledge. There may be a tension between that American liberal view of liberal education, pragmatist view of liberal education, and conservatism. Because part of this view, as Jefferson said, he didn't want any religion at the University of Virginia. He didn't want any dogmatism. He didn't want any tradition at the University of Virginia. He lost that battle, big time, actually. But what happens in the pursuit of new knowledge in a university guided by the pragmatist principles of liberal education, what happens is as you are empowered to learn new methodologies to solve new problems, you study old texts and old methodologies so as to have self-consciousness about the way your empowerment might actually result in pernicious consequences. You learn intellectual humility so that your empowerment to engage in technological development is not at the expense of everyone around you. You learn the responsibilities of education in this pragmatist vein because a capacious pragmatist of the kind that, just say, Jane Addams and John Dewey were, a capacious pragmatist knows that inclusion is also an important value in problem solving. So in 2.5 minutes now that are left to me, I think, or something like that, I give you I think there are 4 components of this liberal education, and it could be at any university. It doesn't matter what your requirements are. It doesn't matter, actually, what color the faculty is or what political party they belong to. But if these 4 elements are there, I think there's a possibility that that university can be characterized by liberal education. And it could be a business school, it could be an engineering school, or it could be a college of arts and sciences. The first one is that education is tied to freedom. Jefferson called it education to liberate. That education should set you free, not freedom of the kind that was characteristic of the European tradition of liberal arts education, which was the freedom to not do stuff, to study because other people were doing the work. The American view of freedom, the American view of being liberated is to liberate to work, to be productive. Jefferson thought that greatest freedom came when you were working really hard, pushing at the borders of knowledge, not when you were in your backyard in the Paris countryside reading ancient texts. Liberate. Second one is animate. And I use in my book Emerson for this, but you see it all the time. I'm sure you see it at Yale. We see it at Wesleyan all the time, that students who are free to learn so as to acquire methodologies that allow them to solve problems, students who are free to learn see in the world around them more life, The world becomes more vivacious. There's more music, there's more art, there's more philosophy, there's more nuance to business and mathematics and physics and chemistry. So education shouldn't just narrow you into a particular stream of problem solving. A liberal education, even in this pragmatist view, as Emerson said, education should make the world come alive. More of the world, more alive to you. And you should leave your college or university, whether you're studying engineering or history, more open to the liveliness of the world. The third, and only four, the third element would be cooperation. So you have liberation, animation. The third is cooperation. And this is what, in my account, Jane Addams brings to the mix of liberal education. Learning just to read by yourself, learning just to study alone, learning just to get your transcripts so that you can show people you took a course in ancient philosophy. This is the ticket to being ineffectual and being a poor citizen and a poor neighbor. Liberal education should teach you, Jane Addams explained in great depth and with real power. Education should teach you how to work with other people because you see things from their points of view. Now, if everybody around you has the same point of view, that talent is lost on you. Intellectual diversity is so important because you have to see things from the points of view of people who don't agree with you. And the fourth and final element of a liberal education. After you have been liberated, after you've learned to animate the world, after you have learned that cooperation is a virtue of the educated mind, the fourth is that you have more power to instigate change. Education is not about conserving the past in this American pragmatic tradition. Education is being able to instigate change because you have been empowered by the knowledge of the past, challenged by the problems of the present to create a future that's better for you and for the people with whom you're cooperating. That could be true whether you're studying physics or religion. Liberate, animate, cooperate, and instigate. If those four things are there, I think you have an ideal university because you have a university characterized by pragmatic liberal education.
Michael, we were just being polite. You gave yourself away in your last book when you spelled Alan Bloom's name wrong. That's a joke. But he did. Okay, cards are on the table here. And I know there's a pent-up wish to ask questions because I was here in the last panel. So we're going to just throw it open. If you have questions for a specific panelist, please do so directed. Otherwise, we'll give everybody a chance. Thank you.
I agree with most of your prescriptions for what is a good liberal education. How would you fit in the proliferation of Black studies and Jewish studies and American Indian studies and 5 assistant deans for each one of those? How do they relate to the ideal of a liberal education?
Well, I think they're perfectly consistent with the ideal of a liberal education. I know that white studies is much more prevalent in the traditional colleges and universities, but I don't see. I mean, just the principle of charity makes me say I don't see any reason why one would feel that biophysics or molecular biology or finance, which is now taught in my economics department, it wasn't a few years ago, would be more of a threat or less of a threat than African American studies or Jewish studies or immigrant studies. I guess I don't really see the thrust. I don't see the problem of adding fields of study. I don't know any schools where you have to have assistant deans for new departments. I know there are a lot more assistant coaches than there used to be. I actually don't see. I'm not threatened by in fact, I'm thrilled that there are new fields of study. When I never heard the word gamelan before I came to Wesleyan. It seems to me that, we're actually, Yale and Wesleyan are doing a joint thing with a sultan who's bringing us gamelan instruments. But the fact that now I know about gamelan doesn't seem to me to threaten my ability to spell Alan Bloom right.
Yes. Oh, I guess I don't have to do this.
Are safety cultures on college campuses like advancing or hindering the pursuit of liberal education?
Is what cultures, I'm sorry?
Safety cultures,
You want to say more about what you have in mind?
like safe spaces and trigger warnings.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are problems, and I think there's space to actually have some reasonable conversations and make some accommodations with those that are motivated by the concerns that lead them to advocate for trigger warnings and safe spaces and the like. So my concern about safety culture is a perfectly reasonable way of talking about it. My concern about this is that it has had a tendency on some campuses to want to exclude a range of ideas from the campus because they're seen as threatening to a set of commitments or a set of identities of some people on campuses, such that then we want to characterize the entire campus as a kind of safe space in which people will not feel under attack for certain kinds of views. And I think that has to be resisted. That universities are precisely places where we talk about controversial and difficult ideas that sometimes are in fact going to be very challenging to people's fundamental commitments, including their sense of identity. And we want that space to occur on campus. At the same time, I think we need to be open to the idea, and I think it's attractive, in fact, to have both literal as well as metaphorical spaces on campus where people feel like they can gather together in solidarity with like-minded individuals, that there is emotional value in that, there's intellectual value and social value in that, and universities should have spaces in which that's possible. And I don't think those two things are antithetical to one another. At the end of the day, it ought to be possible to understand a university as being an extremely inclusive place where you're trying to bring as many people into it as possible in order to talk about a wide range of ideas. They're often going to be difficult and challenging that we're going to disagree about fundamentally, while also trying to identify ways in which those people can live comfortably with one another and actually have those productive conversations as much as possible. And where I worry that we get off the rails in trying to do that is if we think that in order to be adequately inclusive, that what that implies is the necessity to crowd out certain kinds of viewpoints and certain kinds of arguments. And I think then we're sacrificing what it is that makes universities attractive in the first place and exactly what we're trying to bring people into.
Yeah, I agree. I would just add that, I've been a professor since the early 80s. Actually, Harry Jaffa was my colleague in Claremont when I started teaching. He routinely and publicly, it is in print in the student newspaper, referred to gay people as sodomites. And if you were a gay student at Claremont McKenna College, you had a life of regular harassment and intimidation. It was not a safe place to be gay. And I think it's an enormous improvement that, for the most part, that's not true at CMC or many colleges and universities across the country. But when that appeal for safety becomes an appeal for protection from ideas rather than protection from harassment or intimidation, then I agree completely. But I've seen these changes for certain groups, and certainly in my lifetime.
Could I add something here just for a minute? I was not surprised, but a bit disappointed at the idea of Jefferson as the great hero at this point in the history of this country. I taught at his university for 8 years. Jefferson did no work in his life. He lived on the sweat of his blacks, not the sweat of his back. He and Madison and Monroe put our country on an extraordinarily negative course in pretending that you were a pragmatic Democrat when you were a slave owner. He sired children on Sally Hemings and denied it. He was a scientific racist himself and encouraged scientific racism in a way that was toxic for the history of our country. I think he's a nauseating hypocrite, and I think it's a good thing we're able to disagree about it.
No, I think his hypocrisy is legendary. I mean, it's a wonderful part of a Broadway musical, but his hypocrisy doesn't undermine all the things you said. I do think there are people today who think that you can take any ideas from someone who has some ideas that are morally reprehensible. But all of the ideas you mentioned, I agree with you, are morally reprehensible.
Yeah, my mom would be very upset if I didn't come to the defense of Jefferson, and the defense I would offer on this front is not necessarily disagreeing with some of those specific details, which I think are quite reasonable points of concern about Jefferson and things we need to take into account in thinking about his legacy. But there are extraordinary ideas contained in Jefferson. They're extraordinarily important to both the country and I think the American conservative movement. And we ought to be able to separate out some of what motivates people, some of their own biographical features, some of their own hypocrisies from some of the ideas that they offer to us and some of the legacies then that they genuinely have provided to us. They're ultimately quite valuable. And Jefferson is among those who I would disagree with on lots of details of his personal life, but whose ideas I think are actually extraordinarily important.
I would just add, while that microphone's going around, that I've had experience of teaching in the Warrior Scholar program every summer for the last 5 years, which addresses people who are transitioning from the military and want to boost into the new college situation that they're entering. And when we went through the Declaration of Independence with all 15 of the warriors, it was an astounding thing, and to watch as people seemingly for the first time seem to understand this we question. So all I can say is I have had extreme good luck in some of the things that Michael was talking about in terms of freedom and how you actually open that view to people using some of the great work of Jefferson.
Surely you don't credit Jefferson for the fundamental ideas of the Declaration, which he himself said in a famous letter to Henry Lee is a consensus document for which he was the secretary. The idea that Jefferson invented such ideas is not really very valid, is it?
I don't think that was done by committee. I've heard all the quotes, but I mean, most of the actual expression of the Declaration is attributed to him, as nonchalant as he was about it.
Do you think any of those ideas are his original ideas?
I think he shared them.
Hello, I'd like to, I appreciate the discussion on Jefferson, by the way. I would love to ask, how can we counter the current, for lack of a better word, obsession of overlaying a pragmatic approach to education with everything that we engage in college? I think it's one of the most toxic things that we do here. And it was something that I was guilty of before I dared to explore a program that Professor Thompson has spoken of, Director of Studies, along with some of my classmates here. I think that when I came to college, I viewed it purely as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. But I realize now that so much of the knowledge that we gain here, particularly in liberal arts fields, has no specific or predictable application because it has an infinity of applications. It will serve me regardless of the field that I choose, instead of choosing a language or this class or that one, because it's the next big thing when the thing about change is that it's unpredictable. So I'd like to know, how can we help students, particularly freshmen and high school seniors, realize the value of a broad liberal arts education, again, when there's such a focus on the employment market, when internship applications shift and slide ever earlier in the college career?
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to say, I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I did include the statistic about directed studies, which is 125 students. That's it. I'm not suggesting that I've really got the answer, because that is such a tiny, tiny proportion of students. And if we're to do what you're suggesting, there has to be a way to reach more people. And we haven't done that. The program is too tiny. But I do a lot of traveling to other universities where I get invited to speak at honors colleges, for example, Mississippi State University this fall, or several places in the South, actually, where the population is mostly engineering students, And they've nevertheless created this kind of program, which is importantly optional. They usually label themselves honors college, but they do the kind of thing that I was talking about and that you're recognizing, which is shared text, so that you're talking about ideas, that you're respecting the life of the mind. There is no requirement about which texts they must be. If they're really good texts, it's going to work. I have the same experience every summer with the military people. These are people who, by and large, don't have a very good high school education, never mind a pre-Yale kind of one. And they react magnificently. It doesn't almost matter what we teach with them. It can be Tocqueville, it can be Robert Dahl, it can be any number of things, but when you start taking ideas seriously and allowing debate, unbelievable things can happen. It's not so hard. I mean, I'm contradicting myself in a way because, we want more numbers in directed studies, and there's all sorts of pressures that work against it, but I do find, and I'm sure it's true of everybody up here, if you get a book you love and you stand in front of a class, it is not hard to awaken that kind of thirst for ideas that you're talking about. Just get someone who loves the books and see what happens.
What would happen what's the most popular major at Yale these days? What would happen if actually in your major you had to take ideas seriously? Instead of having to do that in 9 classes or whatever it is, or 6 classes in your first year, what if in your major in economics or history or psychology you actually had to take ideas seriously instead of sequestering it into a program for serious ideas? If they do, then you could actually have a broad liberal education within their majors, and you wouldn't have to say that the directed studies program, where we read books for their own sake, is the place where liberal arts occurs in the curriculum. So there's a difference between those schools that say, we dedicate ourselves to this group, this small group, whether it's an honors college or a core curriculum, and those that say, we actually think you should teach economics and history and engineering and physics with a mind to ideas and not just techniques.
That's right, and I agree with that completely. I had a econ senior in my class a few years ago who finally took a course in the humanities, and it was a rhetoric course, and so we spent a lot of time analyzing the writing, and he did his final paper on his textbooks in econ, and it was a life-changing experience for him. It was like everything was clear suddenly, and it was transformative because he suddenly saw how narrow his education in that major had been. He suddenly saw himself as manipulated by the kind of language that is used in an econ textbook. I couldn't agree with Michael more. That's the way a lot of our majors are going. I was a history major in the times when there were so few requirements. It was one here, one there. I ended up with not knowing anything really because I had no integration, no periodization, no history of Western Civ, anything like that. I ended up having to put together my own education, and that's what I feel like a lot of our majors do to our students. Because they are so specialized and rigid about what you must do, the students aren't getting exposed to texts that might actually feel like they transform them or that they touch them in some human way, change the way they think, change what they aspire to, or something along that self-transformative mode. Anyone want to comment?
I might want to. I'm interested in trying to move on to a new question, although I do have things about that, but I'm conscious there are people wanting to jump in.
Oh, sorry.
President Roth, are you in favor of there being no distributional requirements, no required courses? And if you are, can you explain to me why this applies at the university level, but from K to 12, it doesn't?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the second part. I don't think that young people in the K through 12 level are ready for making the kinds of choices that many college students, not all, are ready to make. So I do subscribe to something like a Hirsch approach of trying to indoctrinate our students as best we can with the best things we know when they're very young, and then instigate rebellion against those things when they're old enough to make choices. At Wesleyan, no instigation is required, alas. But I'm afraid I'm going to give you a little wishy-washy answer on the meat of your question, which is, I don't think there's one way to do this. At some schools, I think a core curriculum works very well for precisely the reasons that people have mentioned, because it gives a sense of common discussion points, of common purpose. And at other schools, Wesleyan, we don't have requirements, but we have expectations. So we manage through guilt at Wesleyan.
You expect people to have a foreign language.
You don't have to do anything. And most of our students do it. Most of our students choose to do it. Like 85% of our students do a foreign language, and they do the breadth of their curriculum. And I think that it really depends on what kind of student body you have. I think at Chicago, Columbia, Yale, I mean, these are great programs. I would love to teach in them. But I think at other schools, because of the student culture and the faculty culture, students do acquire a breadth of learning without being required to do so. And I guess I have some sentimental attraction that things that aren't required will become more valuable to people than things that are required. But that's not true for everybody at all places.
Thank you all, panelists, and thank you for enjoying or participating in this.